Hey. So the topic of anxiety has come up in a renewed way in the last 5-6 weeks for our group. And it's not just you. In fact, I don't think it's just us. But I wanted to say a small thing to address a new and common sort of node of the anxiety, which is the topic of getting out the door of the house to get to practice. So again, that's not just you. That seems to be a little bit of a sub-theme. And the thing that I'm hearing from people is like, I am having trouble doing what I want to do. I have a plan, I have a program for the day, and yet at the moment of taking action, of getting out the door into the world, I'm hitting some sort of block of like crippling anxiety. So again, it's not just you. This is an occasion, I think, to distinguish between the sort of anxiety that attaches to a particular cognitive or behavioral experience and the bigger piece of the free-floating anxiety that is part of the experience of a lot of us these days and part of the experience of just living on planet Earth in 2021. That's what I mean about it's not just you, it's not just us. That is a pretty common theme. So first, the free-floating bit. I think that we have to acknowledge that the practice makes you pretty sensitive, which is great, but you sometimes have access to more information about yourself than you did before. And at the same time, that self-awareness can make you more empathic. So even as you sort of strengthen your sense of centering, sometimes you can be more porous and available to the emotional states of people around you and people in the world, right? So some of that free-floating anxiety that many of us, I think, are picking up on is by virtue of having a sense of what's going on, not just within our own experience, but in the world now. There are multiple overlapping apocalypses playing themselves out. And it's easier if you don't feel them, right? And I do think at this level of practice, though, it can be empowering to kind of give yourself a break, to recognize that in this world historical moment, there are many reasons that one might feel anxiety and that one might be picking it up from one's environment. I don't want to reduce anything about that. And at the same time, there have been apocalypses before. And the little that I've learned about previous experiences of feeling like I was living in a moment of everything coming apart, in a moment of threat and doom, is that, as cliched as it is, there is a real difference to the worldviews that are based on fear and the far fewer and more difficult worldviews that are based on love. And I grew up in a very strange place that was full of doomsday preppers and that was characterized by xenophobia. Rural Montana in the 1980s. And as far as we were concerned, the Cold War was still happening. The end of the world was prophesied and on its way. There are so many bunkers out there in the areas up and down the Yellowstone River in Montana. And the sense of the shared reality is one of doom. And it is one of isolationism. And it's based on fear. And there were different choices that could be made in those settings and different visions of the future, even in the midst of terrible situations. And now there's no reducing the reasons that we have for fear. And at the same time, having a background worldview that's growing out of those fears, which is, what most of our society is suggesting that we do, can lead to a sense of free-floating, pervasive, constant anxiety and near shutdown. And there are other ways. In the midst of apocalypse, you can still build a worldview based on love. And for all practical purposes, I do think that it can have the effect of helping us manage the free-floating anxiety that's just part of this zeitgeist that we're living in. So that's the general thing. Now the hacks that I could suggest around this bit of the very concentrated anxiety that sometimes creates a pattern that feels much more personal when it comes to taking action. So that said, let's continue to give ourselves a break if there is some sort of block around getting out the door. We spent 2 years in a world where a lot of messaging had to do with the unsafety of crossing that threshold to go outside of your door. So really deliberately repatterning that act of follow through on taking action can be useful for undoing some of that really subconscious or deep mind stuff that we may be coming up against when that moment of anxiety arrives, right? So the really helpful thing to understand when it comes to repatterning is that the mind body usually needs 30 to 40 days to set a new pattern. And that doesn't necessarily mean the new pattern is I get up and I go out the door to yoga first thing every morning. It could be I do that every other morning, right? There's still a sense that if your body's going to if your mind's going to accept the new thing that you do, there has to be some relentless repetition for a while to undo the old pattern. I think on a purely practical level, part of what we're running up against is the intention to have the new way of being come up against the old way of being that was really heavily solidified due to lots of fear, right? And so the first thing is to just give yourself 30, 40 days of relentlessness. If it is truly the case that this is what you want to do, is get up and run out of the door every single morning, right? And you might run into that old pattern repeatedly, but it will play itself out if you strengthen the new pattern. Again, if that's actually what you want to do. So the nature of mind, number 2, is on the cognitive level, the sort of, this part of the mind, the monomaya kosha. It is to think. It is to do memory, plan, fantasy, rumination, all that kind of stuff. And it wants to feel like it's participating in useful. The mind, if it's allowed to be in the driver's seat of our being, will just meow, 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 all day long. It'll do the what if at you up until the moment that you have turned on your car and left the house. The amount of energy that is wasted by staying in bargaining and in what ifing in the mental level instead of just reducing your decision tree to a yes or a no for all practical purposes. It's just an immense amount of energy that will be wasted. And so recognizing that the nature of mind is to babble and negotiate, and actually just being like, mind, okay, you have a certain thing to contribute in that area, and that is not needed now. At a certain point in your timeline will save you the energy that is wasted with bargaining and negotiation. This is there is no try, there is only do or do not do. That's, there are lots of places that's not true, but that's a comment on the bargaining mind that wants to keep you in what if land. Third, this is the thing that helped me. um, in a very different place and time, Los Angeles in the early 2000s. So very different conditions, but the hack still works. For me, I figured out after some false starts that if I'm going to go get up at 6 and go to the shaman at 6, all the behaviors mentally and in an embodied sense that are implied by that 6 o'clock action in the morning actually need to start their process at 3 p.m. the night before, if that's actually going to happen. So I need to start figuring out my eating and my bedtime and downregulation, all this adulting stuff that's just like how to eat and how to sleep, right? The way that I'm going to downregulate myself in order to be, in bed at 10 or 11. All of that stuff. This was also during the time that I stopped drinking when I realized that was like actually going to make it impossible to practice on any deep level the next day. And it was kind of a fake downregulation, at least in my system. So that 3 o'clock sort of cutoff was like, if it's 5, the mind isn't even going to ask, am I going to practice or not tomorrow? Like if it's 5 and I'm like still like doing crazy things that are like gonna prevent me from going to bed on time, then it's off the table, right? But if it's 5 and I've already kind of settled into the routines that are gonna facilitate me going to practice in the morning, then I don't need to think about it anymore, right? So that for me, that was the time that practice started for a decade and a half. And well, no, until I started teaching. So for a decade, that I could really, support myself by making my decision at that time, like way before supposed game time in the morning, right? When I started teaching, that moved to 1 p.m. At that point, I was still like busy living my life, but certain things just had to be in place and when it came to eating and sleeping and downregulation and keeping my life together, right? It really wasn't until a few years ago, 3-5 years ago, that moving wall of like, when does practice start? For all practical purposes, it kind of disintegrated in my life. And now there's a sense of like, well, I'm always sort of in the habits and in the patterns that facilitate the sort of mind-body attitude of practice. So it's not a rigid discipline at all. It's very much like the emergence over a couple of decades of a way of being in which I'm always sort of connected to my practice on really practical level. So my question for you would be, what's the time? You can set an alarm for it. It's probably later than 3. I'm just really slow. I just need a lot of time to get my momentum set up to actually take action. Most people are faster. For you, it might be 4, 5, 6, 7 p.m. when there's a cutoff of, okay, all the behaviors and all the mental preparation that are implicated in my going to the practice in the morning, they start now. And so what this does is it removes any moment of decision, right? If it's 5 in the morning and you're going to practice at 6, well, you're already in your practice. You're not actually going to practice at 6. You're doing your practice already. You've been in the stream of it since the afternoon before. And so whatever actions you're taking are already in this sense that, well, I am doing my practice now. The sleep that I'm doing is doing my practice. However it manifests, I'm already in it. Like there's no do or die moment. I'm in it. I'm right. However it shows up, there's no judgment. There's no thing that's going to like spoil it. It's just happening. It's just doing itself. And this is how it's showing up. Right. So that choke moment that we're routing around from a cognitive behavioral standpoint is removed from this game, because it's just like, oh, the things that might have been charged before that might, for various different people in various different ways, have presented themselves sort of as blocks, are no longer part of that, because they are just one like aspect of a vinyasa that was started hours and hours ago, and you don't have to negotiate about it. It's doing itself. The negotiation was done the night before, 3, 4, 5 in the evening, when you decided you were initiating the process of being in your practice. So for most people, this entails a little research. Like, what is the quote practice time that gets all the practical things set up for you? So you kind of play with it, right? And get a sense of like what's too early for you and what's too late for you, and what are if there's going to be self-sabotage, at what point in the timeline does it assert itself, and therefore what other subroutines do you need to create for yourself, so you just cruise right past that, make yourself a little runway. Next morning you're already deeply in the stream of practice, you just arrive on your mat and keep doing your thing, and there's no moment of like drama around it, because the initiation happened the day before. Try it out. Let me know how it works for you.